So as Jamie said, we can see the participants coming in and it slowly ticks up. So we'll kind of wait for it to stop before I'll kick us off.
Yep, I'm just loading up my PowerPoint here, so that gives me time to do that.
Perfect. Hello, folks joining us. We'll get started in just a moment. We're just waiting for other folks to enter into the Zoom room. So we'll give it another 30 seconds or so. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. We're so excited to welcome new participants, as well as those of you who were able to attend our conference in the past. We hope you were able to attend the sessions last week, but if you missed that, or if you wish you could see another one of our breakout panel sessions happening right now, no problem. The presentations are recorded and will be available on our conference website. I'm Angela Willits, and I'm happy you're here for this breakout presentation, Unmasking the Hidden Crises of Missing, Murdered, and Indigenous Women and Girls. On behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging that our University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, here on the shores of Lake Mendota, resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dayjope, or Four Lakes. As the reach of the university extends to the far corners of our state, we also respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you are watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations or you are more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land you are on. And as social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, such as was the aim of boarding schools in this state and across this continent. This conference is rooted in critical reflection on our work as social workers. Our goal is to bring clarity about the past, but also to challenge and inspire us all to move into action in our work in communities once the conference is over. We hope this conference provides space for critical reflection, humility, and openness, which will allow us all to reflect, to hear, and tell truths, and move toward action and transformation to support Indigenous rights, cultural equity, and racial equity. With acknowledgement and gratitude, we move forward today in our journey. A few details before we get started. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website shortly after the conference. We know that many of you attending are curious about the CEUs that you registered for. You're all set. To access this presentation, you were required to provide your name and email, either because you were logged into Zoom or because you provided these upon entering. This allows us to verify attendance, and you'll get CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email in the coming weeks. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted. We have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenter. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we might not be able to get to all questions submitted, but if you enter them, I will be letting Ms. Grable know that there's a question for them to respond to. And now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Lynette Grable. Ms. Grable has been an active advocate for Indian country for over 10 years. She is the founder and director of Not Our Native Daughters, an organization that focuses on the work and education of human trafficking and the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls. Lynette also serves on the Wyoming Governor's Task Force for Missing, Murdered Indigenous Persons and the Wyoming Human Trafficking Task Force. Lynette's prior work was as chair of the Arizona Commission of Indian Affairs at the governor's office from 2014 to 2016. Ms. Grable also advocates for diversity and inclusion of Native Americans, Indigenous preservation of land and water rights, child protection, cultural competency, environmental justice, and voting rights. She is a former trainer and advisor consultant for the DOJ Amber Alert program. Lynette has worked as a subject matter expert and tribal liaison for various research and documentary projects. In 2018, Ms. Grable successfully led a team with the Wyoming Democratic Party to campaign for Representative Andy Clifford. Lynette was then selected to be the 2020 Wyoming delegate for the DNC, and she also accepted the nomination of U.S. House of Representatives candidate from the Wyoming Democratic Party. Although Representative Cheney held her seat, she was proud to be the first Native American to run for federal office in the state of Wyoming. Lynette is dedicated to advancing democracy in Indian country. She provided congressional testimonies on the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act in 2019 and tribal youth suicide prevention in 2016 for the American Psychological Association on Capitol Hill. Not Our Native Daughters has educated over 7,000 professionals, both in urban and tribal communities since 2010. Ms. Grable strives for the growth of a future where Native Americans prevail in all the same areas where other ethnicities succeed. And without further ado, I introduce you to Ms. Grable.
Thank you so much for that honorable introduction. Well, Hahane, Washte, Nialke, and good morning. My name is Lynette Grable. I am your presenter today on the subject of missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls and or persons. You might have heard or seen different acronyms, MMIW, MMIWG, MMIP, which relates to missing, murdered Indigenous persons, or MMIR, missing, murdered Indigenous relatives. They all, gear towards the same issue, which is the issues that we have in Indian country of the crisis of missing, murdered Indigenous persons. So I'm going to go through a PowerPoint today. I'm going to go through some statistics. One of the things I always do, no matter what subject I am presenting on, is I like to present the full picture of what our tribal communities and what Indian country looks like. And this, I like to walk people through the statistics. What are the statistics for the community, for our people in general, just nationwide. And I think it brings a broader view of the correlating issues that feeds into the issues of MMIW. And so I'm going to share my PowerPoint here. And just to reiterate, if you have a question, if there's anything that you want to, expound on, please feel free to submit your question. I have no problems with the questions being done. I will take it as they come in. So feel free to submit your questions as we go along the presentation. I live here at the Wind River Reservation in the heart of Wyoming. I am both Northern Arapaho from the Wind River Reservation, but I'm also Hunkpapa Lakota from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. I started, I'm about to share my screen here. I started, wrong one. I started Not Our Native Daughters back in 2013, 2014. Prior to that, I was, in the field of anti-child sex trafficking, anti-human trafficking. I was really involved in the protection of children during that time. And I also began to learn, the more and more I did the work, the more and more I learned of the statistics specifically for Indigenous women. And children, but the statistics for Indigenous women were just mind-blowing for me. I mean, I still remember, going through my research. I'm really big on research. I'm really big on data. That's something that I like to focus on a lot. I've partnered with others to do a lot of other research projects throughout the years. Most recently, the Missing Murdered Indigenous Persons Report for the state of Wyoming back in last year, was released early of last year. Which I was happy to play a small part in, but I was able to, give some input and advice on it. But research and data really, for those who work in those areas, we understand that it's just a small snapshot of the issue. And so, data and research really kind of tells a story. And this is why I always begin my presentations with data and research, because I think statistics, really show us what the crisis or what the problem is. And so, but back in 2012, 13, around that area, I was doing a lot of anti-human trafficking work, women's protection of women, all women, and the statistics were worse for Native American women. The violence against women were worse. The stalking, the rape, cases. But not only was our statistics the worst, but so was the side of coming to justice, the side of having cases being closed and processed and investigated. It really showed me there was a discrimination when it comes to cases of Indigenous persons. And so this was what compelled me to start Not Our Native Daughters, not only to get the education and awareness out there, but to also, collaborate with others and get others who are willing to fight against this. One thing I always say, and I say this a lot, I've been quoted on this many, many times, but I still say it, I stand before you, a full-blooded Native American woman, but the statistics that hang over my head is that I am the most stalked, raped, murdered, sexually assaulted than any other ethnicity in our country. And Native American women suffer domestic violence 50 times higher than the national average. Another statistic that's not in my PowerPoint that I will share is that there's 574 tribal nations in our country, 574. Only 58 of those 574 tribes have domestic violence or sexual assault shelters. So that, again, draws a picture on I think, as Indigenous people and advocates like myself, educators like myself, we feel like we're on the back burner of things when it comes to our issues. So give me a second here. I am going to share my screen. Okay. Are you guys able to see that? I hope you guys are see that. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Give me 1 second here. So again, you are aware of the subject, missing murdered Indigenous persons or missing murdered Indigenous women or girls. I always like to present who I am. I've explained that I'm both Northern Arapaho and Hunkapala Lakota. I always like to start off with my last name. That's the origin of my last name. My father is Hunkapala Lakota from Standing Rock, and I have a lot of ancestral and heritage ties in Wyoming. Some of you may be aware there is a town in Wyoming called Grable, Wyoming. This is where my name originates from. So the oral history that's been passed down to me and what I've been told, and of course that's a picture of me at my grandma's house. So there was a albino buffalo, I don't know how long ago, I would say 100 or 200 years ago, that was in that area. And a young warrior, Sioux warrior, had, killed an albino buffalo, and that's how he got his name. Because in our traditional ways, we gained our name and what we were called for the rest of our lives by what we did, or what our gift was, or what our purpose was, what other people saw in us. And so he did a great thing by killing this white buffalo. This was a drawing that somebody did many, many years ago for my family. But that is the origin of my last name. And so, I'm happy to still carry that name. If you look at or know any Indigenous person or a friend or family or relative, we all have some very unique last names, and there's always a story behind it. So this is my story. I am also, not only am I a director of a nonprofit, but I'm also a mother of 3 children. I have a college student, which is my oldest. He goes to the University of Denver, and I have a high schooler, and I have a 6th grader. So my life is very full, but I think, you know, out of all the accomplishments I've had in my life, I do believe my children are like my best and foremost, most prized accomplishment that I've ever succeeded in. But these are my children. I kind of already gave the background on how I started Not Our Native Daughters. And of course, you know, again, you know, I worked in the field of human trafficking, the protection of violence against women, you know, sexual assault, things of that area. But when I started Not Our Native Daughters, it was specifically to do it for the protection of Indigenous women and girls and persons. So again, we're going to go through some statistical view. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started on that. I'm going to discuss human trafficking in Indian country. You know, for those of us who work in the MMIW movement, you know, and know of the cases of missing persons in Indian country, human trafficking is a huge stem on why we have an MMIW crisis. So every time I speak about MMIW or MMIP, I always make sure that I'm reflecting upon human trafficking as well. So I usually do this phone survey, but for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. But I'm going to go through some statistics from the U.S. Census Bureau. There is some statistics in there from the NCAI Violence Against Women statistic research that was done in 2018. So I just want to go ahead and reference that really quickly. I think I went to, oh yeah. So there's about 6.7 million population of Indigenous people, Native Americans here in the States. And about half is about full-blooded Native Americans, and the others are either mixed with other races. I'm gonna skip over this. So, sorry, I think like so American Indian Alaska Native takes up 2% of the US population. So if you compare that to the groups of, you know, whites, African Americans, and Hispanic, you will see the vast margin there. So, I like to start with that because, you know, if we have such a small percentage when it comes to people groups, you know, and then you take the worst statistics, that should show you, what a devastating it is for us in tribal communities to have such diverse statistics in so many different things. Native American youth suffer at the highest rate of child abuse, sexual assault, molestation, trauma, neglect, and exposure to violence. And this is something I stated before, but Native American women experience domestic violence at the rate of 50 times higher than the national average. Give me a second. I see a question popped up here. Sorry. Oh, that was.
They're just logistical questions. I've got them. Thank you.
Okay, all right, just making sure. I can get this out of my way. Like I stated before, Native American women are the most raped, assaulted, stalked, and murdered out of all ethnicities. I'm sorry, really quickly. It looks like I pulled up and sorry guys, I just gotta. Okay, there it goes. I didn't know what was going on. The highest poverty rate in tribal communities are usually, I think the top 3 counties, poorest counties in the US are occupied by reservation land. And this is something I always say as well, anywhere in the world where you see extreme poverty, you will always unfortunately find human trafficking or the selling of children and women. sorry, it looks like my PowerPoint got discombobulated a little bit, but the number of single race American Indian Alaska Native veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces, according to statistics. So not only we make a small percentage of the population in the country, but we also are overrepresented when it comes to Native Americans in the armed forces. Native American communities suffer the highest unemployment rate. Some areas is about 95% in some areas. You know, just to kind of expound on that a little bit, you know, there's a lot of reservations that are not near towns or cities. And usually this is where those higher unemployment rates are coming from. You know, I've visited reservations that took 3 to 4 hours to drive to from the nearest town or city. And so, you know, when we talk about, and mind you, when Native Americans and tribal nations were put on reservation land, and you know, the land, of course, the treaties were not honored, so they kept getting smaller and smaller. You know, these areas were usually in the most desolate areas that crops couldn't be harvested, you know, areas where, you know, they didn't see the land deemed to be good for you know, homesteading and things of that nature. And so a lot of the reservation, especially for us here in the Northern Plains, you know, the reservations are in very rural areas, very vast areas. So, you know, for these communities that are very far away from society, it's really hard to obtain a job, or it's even hard to just, you know, excel yourself, whether it's education, whether it's schooling. Not all, you know, reservations or tribal communities, you know, are in vast areas, but I would say a good portion of those 574 tribes are in very rural and vast regions. Native American single mothers rate the poorest out of all nationalities in the US. And we have the lowest life expectancy. There's a whole backstory behind the lowest life expectancies for Native Americans, but we have the lowest life expectancy out of all ethnicities in the nation. I've heard as low as, and this fluctuates as far as statistics and research is done, but it's mostly behind health disparities. Some of you may have known that, you know, when the pandemic hit, not only was, you know, African Americans had a high rate of mortality, but so did Native Americans. I did this in my own community, both in Standing Rock and here at Wind River. I mean, we've lost a lot of people to COVID-19. And that also correlates to our resources of health, health resources, clinics, hospitals. You know, for us, we're in a rural area. You know, if we have to go to the hospital, we have to drive 2-3 hours to get to a major hospital that can, or we have to get, if it's serious enough, they'll get life flighted to either Salt Lake City or Denver. So it's just, you know, having that means of having, you know, good and solid healthcare and a healthcare system. So again, I mean, just goes back to something I stated before. You know, why are the issues that we face? Those things are usually put in the back burner, and so health disparities is a big role on why we have a lowest life expectancy. But I've heard these numbers fluctuate from 46 to like 55 years old. But even if you took the higher number of 55 years old as a lowest life expectancy, that's relatively pretty young still. So, I mean, these are just things that correlates into all the other issues that we already have in our tribal communities. And I also will say this, you know, some reservations and some tribal communities, you know, they are more advanced than other tribal communities. Some have gone a long far way, especially in the realms of education, you know, or having their own facility, their own hospital. You know, some reservations are more progressive than others, or have more support either through the state or federal level, or by their own means of self-determination, through casino revenue or other means of revenue. So, those things fluctuate from reservation to reservation. However, it's still a nationwide issue of why are we having such a lowest life expectancy. I actually would like to see more data and research specifically on this, so we can begin to get to the root causes of not just what the health disparities are, but what are the lack of resources that we're not getting, especially for our elders. Our elders, they are the ones who are most in need of, quality healthcare, and most communities don't have it. Highest death rate due to tragedy, accidental deaths, and substance abuse causes. Our Native children are overrepresented in childcare cases, 1.6%, yet are only about 1 or 2% of the population. American Indian and Alaska Native women experience higher rates of violence. Indigenous women experience violence more commonly by non-Native perpetrators. Indigenous victims of violence are less likely to receive needed services. So again, just goes back to what I've already stated. We have just a lack of resources. So I know for our community here at Wind River, we're the 7th largest reservation out of all of Indian country. We have, over 100 acres of 100 million acres of land. Of course, we only occupy one small part as far as where we live and where we reside and things of that nature. But the lack of resources for, domestic violence victims, sexual assault victims, dating violence, partnership violence, the two-spirit LGBTQ community, they have lack of resources, suicide prevention. I mean, just about everything that every community should have, I can say we definitely lack in. As far as the shelters go, I'm working on opening up my own shelter for, it's going to be a safe house for not only human trafficking victims, but for domestic violence and sexual assault victims. So we will have a shelter, and I'm glad to be working on that this year. Hopefully I'll be launching in the next 30 days. That's what I've been, working every day on. But again, it takes a lot to get to the point to provide direct services, because again, the lack of resources, funding, all of those things play a role. But I would say this, just as a woman, wherever, no matter where I live, I should have available resources to get help if I'm a victim of violence. And most tribal communities do not have that. More than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. Sorry, I don't know what happened to my background on my thing, but even now we are still only seeing an interest in the MMIW epidemic because a white woman went missing. And I'm only here speaking to you today because this was for another thing, and this is what my statement is to give you the story on. So when Gabby Petito case, this several months ago, when she went missing in Yellowstone National Forest, not only was there local attention and statewide attention, national attention, but there was also worldwide attention. And, just to draw a contrast there, not to take anything away from the Petito family, because that case was how it's supposed to be done. Everybody on deck, all fire and rescue on board. We had law enforcement from 3 different states to come and look for her, and everybody was paying attention to it. her case was exactly how it should be for any woman who is missing, whether they're, Hispanic or African-American or Indigenous or Asian. This is how it's exactly how her case is a great picture and a display of what it should be when a young woman goes missing. Well, just 2 months prior to Gabby Petito going missing here in Wyoming, we had a 14-year-old girl from our community of Fort Washakie that went missing. She was 14 years old, young, very young girl. She didn't even get local attention. Not even the local papers shared her story or shared her picture or shared her missing flyer. So there is a huge problem in our American culture and in our society where we deem, and I'm not here to elicit guilt in any type of way, but there is some, and I'm talking in a broader picture here, there's something wrong when a white woman is more important than a person of color. Because if you think about any national cases of a missing person in the last 5-10 years, or just think about the last 3 missing women cases you've ever heard of in our news, our national media, our local news, have any of them look like me? None of them have looked like me. So there is a problem, and there is a problem on putting a white woman more important than someone else. For us here at the Wind River Reservation, and I would say most tribal communities, we understand that our stories of being missing or being murdered or even exploited, we understand that we're not primetime material for media. We're not as important to law enforcement or even search and rescue when it comes to one of us that are missing or even found murdered. I've sat with families that had missing daughters, even missing sons, and I've sat with families in law enforcement offices, and I've heard law enforcement say they'll show up, they're just out drinking or they're out partying, whatever their excuse was, but they downplayed the importance of putting all men on deck for that missing Indigenous person, while the mother and the family took everything they got to come to that law enforcement office and sit there with them, and they're barely able to be coherent. So yes, there's a huge problem when it comes to someone of color going missing, specifically Indigenous women or persons, and even child in this case, because 2 months before Gabby Petito's case, we had a child, 14-year-old girl, she's still missing, Cameron Hill, but nothing was ever to spotlight her case. Nothing was done to share her story. And even after Gabby Petito's case, and I was swarmed with media, and I was interviewed from BBC to Hong Kong to Russia. I mean, this case had worldwide attention. And even after I explained that the contrast of an Indigenous person going missing and a white woman going missing, her story still wasn't shared. I still shared Cammie's story, this 14-year-old girl that is still missing. So, sorry to go on a rabbit trail there, but this was kind of like what I was feeling. But I see you.
Lynette, hi, Lynette.
Do you have a question?
We had a question pop up. The question is, how do you think the new HUD Continuum of Care funding availability to tribes will impact shelter and housing resources for Native survivors?
Well, to be honest, I haven't really dived into that. I've heard of it, but I'm not too much aware of what the HUD funding is. But I will tell you that I am aware of the lack of housing in tribal communities and the lack of housing stability. Another reason why COVID-19 was such an epidemic for us in Indian country is because there's more than one family in one house. In most tribal communities, I know for us, there's about 2-3 families in one 2 to 3 bedroom house. And so, any funding that goes towards HUD, that goes to housing stability, that goes to, gearing towards housing stability is going to be beneficial. I am not aware of what the HUD grant entails, but if there is something in that grant that says that they're able to provide shelter, domestic violence shelters to serve victims of sexual assault and domestic violence and even human trafficking, then great, because there's only 58 shelters out of 574 tribes that have services. So I'm hoping that a part of that grant can go towards the shelter services across Indian country. Sometimes we get grants and it says that we can use a portion for helping victims of crime, victims of any violent crime, sexual assault or domestic violence, but sometimes that money is never used for that. It's routed elsewhere. So it really depends on who's in the leadership role and managing that grant. And if they do the right thing and making sure those allotted funds are geared towards domestic violence and shelters and things of that nature. But I'm always optimistic. So sorry, I didn't know much about the HUD grant, but hopefully I would say that we would see a lot more domestic violence and shelters popped up due to that grant. And thank you for the question. More than half of Indigenous, American Indian and Alaska Native women, 56.1%, have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. So, I mean, just imagine that's like half of our Indigenous women that have experienced violence in their lifetime. 70% of the violent victimizations experienced by Indigenous women are committed by persons not of the same race. A substantially higher rate of interracial violence been experienced by, the groups of white or Black victims. More than half of Indigenous women have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their lifetime. Almost half of Indigenous women have been stalked in their lifetime. And I mean, all of these statistics are heartbreaking, all of them. However, we think about stalking, and for those of us who've done directed services or worked as a victim advocate or even work in this realm, we know that stalking happens and it's a serious thing. But I know when I used to do direct services as a victim advocate, we've seen this, we see stalking cases from time to time, but it wasn't prevalent. So to see that Indigenous women have higher rates of stalking, to me it's heartbreaking. Indigenous women are 1.7 times more likely than white women to have experienced violence in the past year. Native women also face murder rates more than 10 times the national average in some counties. And another statistic, I'm not sure if I have it on here or not, but some regions where reservations are occupied, their violent crime rate is 20 times higher than the national average. Another thing I want to kind of expound on this is that, for those of you who know what the VAWA Act is, it's very important for the Violence Against Women Act. Not only does it help to the protection of all women, but the protection of Indigenous women specifically in tribal communities. Some years back, we had a good friend and advocate, Deborah Parker out of Tulalip tribe, who, really made the focus on the VAWA Act and had a pilot program where there was 4 tribes that were able to, I'm gonna pause that for a second. But so for any reservation in Indian country, if there is a non-native on reservation land and they commit a felony crime or a violent act against any person, a native person on the reservation, the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, the police department, for that tribal community do not have the authority to arrest or detain that non-native perp. So, this is why the VAWA Act plays a huge role for us obtaining justice, obtaining, investigations on the reservation, because the BIA don't have that authority. Now, some reservations do have that authority because of the VAWA Act, and it's only a handful of the 574 tribes that are out there. But the only thing a tribal PD can do if they're in a situation where it's a non-native on reservation land is call outside law enforcement to come in. And that is what, Sheriff's Department, the surrounding PD, or even Homeland Security or FBI. But they don't have the authority to detain them and even keep them there. There is tactics that they say that you have to remain here until, law enforcement comes, but they can't place handcuffs on them. So there's a lot of cases where there's been felony violent crimes, even against women and children, and the person was not native, so we weren't able to arrest them or detain. So that's very huge. And this is why the VAWA Act plays a huge role for us on obtaining justice, investigations, prosecutions. These are all very, very important. And the VAWA Act just plays a very small role on how we were able to obtain justice in that manner. I'm sorry, go ahead, Angela.
Yeah, we had just another question. Is it known why Native women are victims of these crimes so often?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Angela?
Sure. Is it known why Native women are victims of these crimes so often? Like why the rates are so much higher?
Higher, yeah. I think that there's a lot of correlating issues and risk factors that play into that. This is why I do like a bird's eye view of statistics, because if we talk about one issue in Indian country, we have to talk about all of them. So we talk about the poverty, we talk about the lack of resources, the lack of the things that all communities should have. We don't have them. And so, and then, just as let's say a rape victim or domestic violence victim, if they don't have the means to get direct services or a safe place to go to, this means that they're also not getting pathways to healing, trauma-informed care, things of that nature, because that's what we want to see in victims, right? We want to see them get trauma-informed care. We want to see them address what has been happened to them so that they don't keep, ended up in that same situation. So, there's a lot of, I can go on and on and on what may be the root causes of why Native American women suffer the highest violent acts against women. But again, there's a lot of correlating issues to why that is. And again, like the statistic I shared before, 70% of violent crime against Native American women, 70% of those cases and statistics were not done by Native American men. They were done by other races. So, I think that the portrayal of Indigenous women needs to be kind of shared, not only just a value system within our own communities on the importance of valuing Native American women, but also to the outside culture and society of America that we live in, and we're also valued, because more statistics and more cases and more things that I'm aware of, it feels like other ethnicities or maybe just the society in general think we're dispensable, or that we're not to be as a concern as much. As I explained with Indigenous or missing person cases, law enforcement or media or a search and rescue don't find it necessary and a priority, like put all forces to the front lines to go find that person or investigate. It's just so like, oh, well, it's kind of like nonchalant, honestly. And so again, it takes people like me and you, it takes people people listening to this session to start making those changes in their own world and in their own, their coworkers or their family. Because one thing I always say is we can't do it alone. The only way we change that culture and change that kind of mindset and that viewpoint is by working together and collaborating together. I think a good I would say analogy for that is that we need to, as we've seen like in the civil rights movement, we've seen people come alongside that were not Black, that came alongside to fight for civil rights justice. I feel that this is the same view, that we need to move forward on how we start protecting and valuing not only our Native American neighbors, but Native American women and children, and that we have to do it collectively together. And there's so many other things that kind of feed into that, but telling our stories truthfully in public education is a good way. All of these other untruths about Native Americans that are in the educational system, and the truth about Christopher Columbus, the truth about boarding schools, the truth about all the broken treaties, all the truth of everything that was stolen from us, I think is a good place to start healing and start getting the narrative correct, especially about Native Americans and Native American women. The murder rate of Indigenous women is almost 3 times higher than that of a white woman. The vast majority of Indigenous female victims of sexual violence experience violence at the hands of a non-Native perpetrator, which I've stated before. 21% have experienced interracial violence. Indigenous women were 5 times as likely to have experienced physical violence by an interracial intimate partner versus a white woman, 90% versus 18%. So I've shared a lot of statistics, and I know sometimes that can be heavy. Sometimes when I do more of my in-depth training, would do case studies, it's very emotional. I usually get a larger emotional response, and it's emotional for me to no matter how many times I educate on this, and no matter how many times I train and be able to have the honor to speak to people. These are hard things for me to talk about as an Indigenous person and as an advocate, because you want to see the change, and I have dedicated my life to these changes. But one thing I do rely on is the resilience, and the resilience of my ancestors, and the resilience of my family and my generations that were gone before me, it was much harder for them than it was for me. And I do believe, I'm an optimistic person, but I do believe that we live in a day and time where we have the hearts and minds to do the right thing, to gain social justice, to get equality and diversity, and that us as Native American professionals, even in the political realm, that we don't have to fight for our seat at the table, that it would be a welcome seat. Most often in any topics that I was advocating for, I always had to fight and push my way to, get my voice heard, or be a part of an advisory committee, or make sure something has been done in legislation, both state and federal. It's always a fight to get into those places. But I hope to see as we move along and move forward, that, Indigenous people won't have to fight so hard to get their seat at the table and have their voices be heard. I'm going to go into human trafficking really quickly. I'm sorry, go ahead. I see you, Angela.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions pop up. The first one, why can police officers arrest natives not on the reservation and the BIA can't arrest non-natives on the reservation? Like, why is that?
Yeah, that goes to just government, U.S. government. They don't want to give tribal PD, which is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, law enforcement, that type of authority, to have the authority over non-natives on reservation land for whatever reason. I've heard different groups. I think, I do another presentation called No Clear Avenue to Justice in Indian Country. And it kind of breaks down like the different states, because every tribe that's in a different state, excuse me, they either, they have different rules and usually federal and state, they just don't have the means to do that. It's going to take a lot of undoing. I personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I think it needs to be a revamp of the Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement system and the way justice looks like in Indian country. But that takes a whole lot of work of tribal law and policy. It takes a lot of undoing, because honestly, I will say that, originally the BIA the system was set up to keep us oppressed. That system was to keep Indians on Indian land and that they're not causing any problems. The system was not designed for us, honestly. If you look at the history of Bureau of Indian Affairs, the development, it wasn't created by Native Americans, and it wasn't created for us. And so I just think that it's systemic, it's continued systemic racism. I think it's continued, generational racism that's played out through these different governmental systems. And I think there needs to be a lot of decolonizing of that. And so I visited other, tribal communities, and they're a lot more progressive in their tribal community, either because they have a great relationship with the state, or they're in a prominent area where they have shared values in that county or region. But for us here in the Northern Plains region, it's really, really still very, I would say, as far as racism and bigotry, we experience racism on a daily basis. I still get followed in stores if I'm going to steal something in Safeway, so I mean, the environment for us here in the Northern Plains region is very hostile. It's very blatant racism. And, sorry, I went down that trail because I was talking about the colonization, but, it's going to take a lot of policy changing. And I'll tell you this, when these discussions of having BIA, PD arrest non-natives on law enforcement, a whole lot of people in policy and leaderships, elected officials, both Senate and House, people that hold these seats, they do not want to see that. I've been in conversations with elected officials who just are adamant about having, a BIA officer arrest a non-native. They just absolutely don't want to see that. And to me, that has something to do with racism. That has something to do with oppression and colonization continuing into our modern day. But trust me, there's a lot of people in the House and Senate that do not want to see that, and they will vote against that. So there's a lot of things that need to be done. And this is why it's so very important who's elected and who you stand by, because sometimes when they get in those closed offices and they start having discussions that will promote equality and diversity, they vote a different way. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah, thank you so
another
much.
one.
Yep, we have one other one. How can a group such as those who are participating in this conference help to bring awareness to this very important issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I always love hearing that because again, I always say that we cannot do it alone. All of us are part of our own network, whether it's in your role, in your job or your career, maybe it's you're part of, I think a lot of us are a part of contributing to community well-being. And that means helping the community or working with others or collaborating with others, supporting others. I would say start with those who are in your circle, whether it's your family, your children, other professionals, maybe they're attorneys, maybe they're law enforcement family members, begin to have those discussions. I know that when we started to have more in-depth discussions with law enforcement, I've had personal conversations with law enforcement. and they're not part of the reservation, but they're law enforcement that resides on the border towns of our reservation. And I mean, they were really impacted on the statistics that was taught to them about Native Americans and specifically Indigenous women and children. And so, you know, I know that there's great people out there who do a lot of hard work and put their lives on the line every day, such as our law enforcement folks. But, you know, to start having those conversations can really change and then if you can open the eyes to anyone, you know, you can open their efforts and their heart. And again, you know, I stated before, like, I do believe we live in a time where we have the hearts and minds, the education, the professionals, the people with sound experience to make those changes. And I think it's important to share it with your family as well, because it teaches your children or your family that, you know, the importance of equality for Native Americans, and the importance of having our voices heard. And you can share our voices and share our stories by sharing it with others. Recently, I got a call from a mother who is white, but her son is 15 years old. I was so floored by this conversation, but she told me that every Christmas, their grandmother, you know, tells them that I can get you something. What do you want for Christmas? Or I can donate. And this 15-year-old boy wanted his grandmother to donate. And the mother explained to me that the boy spent like a month on research on MMIW, on protection of, you know, Native American children. And he was just so impacted about the MMIW movement that he wanted his donation to go towards a MMIW organization. And that's how they found me, because of his research and whatever else that he found out there. And I was just so blown away by that, you know, this young man, you know, he's white, you know, and probably he's not exposed to Native American culture or communities, but yet he was able to learn something and be educated on something, and he wanted to do something about it. And so that to me was a power. I mean, I cried with the mother because I just couldn't believe it. This young man was just, you know, wanting to support an MMIW. And I wanted to know, how did he get to that point? So she told me everything along the way. But see, that's why it's important to share it with our family, because you don't know what impact you will make with our fellow family members and what they might do in their own lives. So moving forward.
Yeah, that's such a cool story. I love that. I'm thinking my own kids, would they give up their gift for donation? I love that. So we had one comment and then one question. The comment was that we do have a missing and murdered Indigenous women's task force here in Wisconsin, staffed by the State Department of Justice. And then a question that came in: what would you do to get people to open up to hearing this information when their response is that it isn't happening, or we would hear about it in the news?
Yes, that is an excellent question. And actually, that's the problem. So yes, I mean, I'll relate something to human trafficking. 10 years ago, I think about maybe 13 years ago, I'm aging myself here, but, you know, I was working in the human trafficking movement, and I worked with advocates, not only in my state, but nationwide. And it was just an unheard thing. People did not really know about child sex trafficking or human trafficking. They had a lot of myths that it was foreigners or, you know, women of other countries. They didn't know that it was happening to our American children. You know, it was happening in our counties and in our states and across the nation. And so, and it was the same place, you know, where we were at with MMIW was the same place we were when we were trying to get the education out and legislation change for child sex trafficking laws. And so, you know, like I stated before, when something happens, a violent crime happens to an Indigenous person, whether it's on or off the reservation, it does not even hit local local news half the time. I would say half, probably more than half, but to be fair, let's just say half the time, our missing cases don't hit local news. You know, back in June 29th, like I stated before, we had a 14-year-old girl from our Wind River community that went missing. It didn't even get local attention, let alone statewide attention. And so just because it's not in the media or the newspaper or any other news outlet that is out there doesn't mean that it's not happening. I think there needs to be some diversity and equality when it comes to media, but also in search and rescue and also in law enforcement, showing focus on just investigations of MMIP. But it's happening. Some of us advocates in different states and areas, and just like, you know, we have a task force here too in Wyoming, and I know other great states have an MMIW task force or MMIP task force. You know, those are the things that they're addressing and they're discussing. I know that we're talking about media portrayal. And not only, you know, one of the things that we found in the MMIP report that we did for the state of Wyoming, and I really do hope all states do their own MMIP report, but, you know, and they went back 10 years of you know, all the cases they can find for missing or murdered women or persons, but they found that the missing persons, Native American persons that were in the media were not done in a good light. Meaning, if there was a white person missing, they usually reflected them in a good way, what their accomplishments were, whether in high school or in life, or, you know, talked good about their family. But when there was a Native American person that was missing, they didn't say good things about them in the paper or in the media. You know, they even made statements of that they could possibly be been drinking or partying. And so, you know, the media portrayal and how they view a missing person case versus a Native American versus a white person is very vastly different. And we're usually, when our cases do hit the local paper or, you know, media, it's usually done in a very dark and kind of like it's your fault kind of deal. And so that's some of the contrast that we have seen in the report. And I've seen that in the MMIWG report as well, that some of the portrayal of our cases is just not done in a way that's, I would say, that promotes equality. I think that was your last question, but so really quickly, like I said, human trafficking plays a huge role when it comes to missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls. It's a huge stem on why we have so many cases of people missing or even murdered. And so, you know, again, I always start from the bird's eye view and then I kind of break it on down, but, you know, worldwide, and I think this number is a little bit higher than this amount, but 32 billion in profits is generated by human trafficking industry every year. I think the number one criminal revenue that is out there is drugs. Secondly, it used to be the selling of guns, but human trafficking took that place, and they're the second highest criminal revenue there is worldwide. And like I stated before, I always say this, but anywhere in the world where you find extreme poverty, you will find human trafficking, and unfortunately, you will find the selling of women and children. This is kind of like a blanket view of what human trafficking is for those of you who may have never gotten any type of human trafficking training, but the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, defines the crime of trafficking as a recruitment. And so we see a lot of recruitment. And, you know, I used to train tribes that did not believe human trafficking would happen in their community. And part of the recruitment is usually done on social media. Usually, you know, a young girl or even a young boy will meet somebody online and they'll pretend to be a boyfriend, or they pretend to be someone they're not. They're just using somebody else's pictures. They're thinking they're talking to another 16-year-old boy, you know, and they start having an online relationship and they're my boyfriend now. And then not only that, that's the recruitment stage, but then it gets into the grooming stage. And then they talk to these young persons for 6 to 9 months. Some cases I've even seen 2 years before they came and met with the young person. And unfortunately, that young person is missing, but it's because they got in contact with a trafficker, and they thought they were meeting some guy they were talking to for 2 years or 6 months or 9 months, and they're in love and they're going to go off and be together, but it's end up being a pimp or a trafficker. So we do see recruitment of that in Indian country, and that's how it happens. And then the harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, where such an act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. Now, I always expound on the coercion part because, it, especially in children and especially in teenagers, their maturity and their brain hasn't developed all the way to the part to where they're able to see through, I would say, the lies or the BS. But the coercion part, pimps and traffickers are sociopaths. They're experts on talking other people into doing something that they really don't want to do, or guilt them into it or shame them into it. And unfortunately, a lot of people, young people who are, I wouldn't say all of them, but a good percentage of them already have trauma, traces of trauma in their life. Whether it's from their parents, their family, maybe they come from, foster care system, and maybe some of them don't. I've seen cases where they came from great homes, but they were still able to get coerced. They were still able to get manipulated. Some of you may know aware of the Stockholm syndrome. They are, they become in love with their captor, is what Stockholm syndrome is. It's a mental, like a psychologically way to be manipulated. But there's also a trauma bond and psychological bond that happens when a young person is, or even an adult, because this happened to adults too, are coerced into something that either they don't want to do, they're forced to do, they're threatened to do, they're drugged to do. So, I mean, there's so many, we can go so much deeper into this conversation as far as human trafficking and why human trafficking victims or sex trafficking victims are not at the corner waving their hands, screaming for help. And again, it just goes back to the psychology part of it, of being, having trauma bond and being oppressed. And, we see victims who don't cry out. This is all plays a role why we have a human trafficking issue, especially with our younger ones. The selling of North Americans, Indigenous women, and children for sexual purposes has been an ongoing practice since the colonial era. There is evidence that early British surveyors and settlers view Native women's sexual and reproductive freedom as proof of their innate impurity, and that many assumed the right to kidnap, rape, prostitute Native women and girls without any consequences. So I would say, the selling, the exploitation, the rape, the violence against Native American women, the violence against even Native American children is no new thing. It's not a new thing. This is something that has been going on since the beginning of time. And I would say because of that, we still live in this modern society where we're still viewed as, as not as worthy or not as priority when it comes to a missing, exploited, or murdered case. Again, we still have that type of viewpoint upon us because it's been like that since the first settlers and colonization had occurred. And I think it goes back from there, but it's been prevalent all throughout since then. So MMIW, MMIP is no new issue. So risk factors, traffickers often prey on children and youth. Go ahead, Angela.
We had one question that just came in. There's evidence that Black girls are more sexualized by white people. Do you see AI, NA girls being sexualized more as well?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great statement, especially when it comes to, the human trafficking and the victims of human trafficking. But yes, I used to work with law enforcement some years ago, and we used to do online rescues of youth that were in child sex trafficking cases. And I worked with some of those young girls that were rescued, and this was back when Backpage and, all these other pages, Craigslist even had ads of very, very underage young girls. And we were a task force that would go and try to rescue them. And then the law enforcement officer would propose as a John or a trick. And then the advocates, us, would go out and meet with the young girl. And, but doing that work, we had to go through a lot of ads. And one thing that I learned by doing that work was that Native American women or even Native American children that were on these websites for sale, we were not only sexualized as an Indigenous person or Native American person, but also our selling factor was a little bit greater than other races. And so what I mean by that is, when a pimp or trafficker had a Native American to sell for sex in an ad, that individual could be sold not only as Native American or Indigenous, but also be sold as Pacific Islander, Asian, Hispanic. The exploitation value of an Indigenous person was great for a pimp or trafficker. And I even I've heard a trafficker say that, and so we're definitely sensationalized. We're categorized as exotic. All of those other, exploitive factors of what African-American women and young girls face is the very same for Native Americans. And unfortunately, I used to see the ads of Native American children and young girls who were exploited, not only as Indigenous, but all these other ethnic races as well, to have a larger selling value. But thank you for that statement and that question. But it's very true along the sides with Native Americans and African-American victims. Traffickers often prey on children and youth with minimal family and social support. Estimated 50 to 80% of identified trafficking victims are or have been involved with child welfare services at some point in their lives. Native American children have a high population in the foster care system. Human and sex trafficking is a crime that affects nearly every community across our nation. It is an insidious threat that has proven difficult to track and quantify and exceedingly hard to dismantle. While there is a perception that human trafficking involves international criminals targeting victims living in the developing world, it is commonplace here in the US and in Indian country. We cannot ignore the networks, pipeline, the victims, or the systems that enable human trafficking. One thing I always say is, like, human trafficking is in every community, whether it's rural, Indian country, urban setting, it's everywhere. For the state of Wyoming, we're vast. We're a plain state, but we're also very vast. Towns are sporadic throughout our state. But serving my servanthood on the human trafficking task force, there's a lot of cases that come along all across the state. And so that idea for some people to think that human trafficking doesn't happen or child sex trafficking does not happen in rural places, I can tell you that it's very common. In some areas, rural places have a higher exploitive of children or women because it's rural, because it's smaller. And one of the things I used to do is I used to do hospitality training for tribal hotels and casinos, because it would happen in tribal hotels and casinos. And a lot of tribal casinos are in rural areas for some reservations. So it was very common. And for those who never worked in the realm, it could be hard to see if you're in a hotel or if you're in a city or you're in a casino. But I've seen it myself. I'm able to see, when a girl is working the floor. I'm able to see when a trafficker or pimp is nearby watching that person. It happens very commonly, but it's right underneath everybody's noses. Actually a huge pipeline of human trafficking in communities is through massage parlors. Years ago, I did a lot of work against massage parlors, even worked with Polaris Project on how to change the massage parlor ordinance. And so the massage parlors is another pipeline on how a selling of women or even children happens in our community. Most of the times if I'm in another city and I'm visiting or I'm on work travel and I see a massage parlor and it says open at 10, 11 o'clock at night, I know they're not in there selling massages. They're usually selling something else as well. Prior to colonial contact, American Indigenous people had strong kinship systems and self-governance. Historical documents and oral narratives passed down through families indicate that violence against Native women was very rare, and women were and are acknowledged to be sacred and revered as members of the communities. Some of the oral stories that I've heard from my family is that if there was somebody who would hurt or harm, another person, most likely was a male versus a female, but the male would actually get beat up and be talked to and, get a really large scolding on their acts. And if they continue to be reoffenders, they would just be banished from the tribe. They would no longer have the means to even be a part of the tribe. They would have to leave. I've heard some tribes, and this was not done for violence against women, but this was done there were some tribes recently that if you continue to be selling meth on a reservation, that they would disenroll you from your tribe and make you move off the reservation. I think that type of very strict and upfront structure and guidelines of what we accept in our sovereign nations. I think that's what it needs to take to start changing that. I love the fact that, I think there's only 2 tribes that do it, but they wanted to end meth in their community. So this is what they did. This was what they decided to do. Like, you're going to continue to bring drugs in our community. You will no longer be a member of our tribe, and you will no longer have the ability to live on our reservation. And I think that type of strict structure is what's needed to try to steer the narrative on protection of Native American women and children. The imposition of assimilation policies heavily impact Native communities, fundamentally disrupting family, kinship, and community structures and governance. These policies are embodied in systemic discrimination, boarding school, relocation, involuntary sterilization, the out-adoption of Indian children, and violence against Native women. These historical events have created cycles of trauma within Indian country. So one of the things I always say is that I personally never went to boarding school. I never had to go to boarding school. I was raised with my parents, but my father went to boarding school. My grandparents on my father's side was in boarding school era as well. And so even though I never went to boarding school, I still suffered the passed down trauma of the boarding school era, the associate trauma of the boarding school era, and the damage that it did through my father's bloodline, from my grandmother to my dad and then to me. Now that I've spent a lot of years being educated on trauma-informed care, as an adult, and I can see back as a child on where both my parents, my father and my mother, never addressed the trauma in their lives and how it played out so traumatically within their own lives because they never addressed the trauma. One time I was asking my father about boarding school. I was just curious. I was kind of bombarding him with questions and just trying to get a grasp on what it was like to be in boarding school. And my dad, I have a total of 12 different uncles, mostly uncles and aunts from my dad's side, and they all had to go to the same boarding school. And my dad and my uncle Blair, they're just 1 year apart. And he said they were only about 5 years old, 5, 6 years old. My aunt, which was the bigger sister, and she was about 6 years older than them. Well, anyways, he said, just imagine, and at this time, my sons were young, they're about 4 or 7 years old. And he just said, just imagine you taking your 2 boys, putting them in a car, going to a stop in the middle of nowhere, and putting your kids on this bus, and the kids are hanging out the bus crying, and the parents are on the side crying too. Sorry. I can't imagine that type of trauma. And that was just one incident that he told me about. There was other stories that he told me, and that kind of trauma that not only stays in that person's life for the rest of their lives, but just like I stated, I suffered the passed down trauma, the associate trauma, the trauma that my parents and my grandparents never had the means or the resources to deal with. There was no trauma-informed care type of language in those days. And so, the boarding school era is something that for us in Indian country, we are still facing on a daily basis. And whether it's again, with the passed down traumas, or whether it's lateral violence, oppression mentality, it's just a lot of different effects to that trauma. Another incident that he told me about the boarding school era that he had to experience is the boarding school that he went to there, the boys and the girls were separated. And since my aunt was my dad's older sister was probably a mother-like figure to them, my dad and my uncle, when they would enter the cafeteria, they would enter the cafeteria and they would wait to see their sister on the other side so they can time their time in the line, because the line was like a zigzag line, so that when the 2 lines meet, they were able to see their sister. And I had another conversation with my aunt about that, asking her about it. And she said it would just kill her because my dad and my uncle would see her and just hold on to her and cling to her and didn't want to let go. So these are just one story. There's so many other thousands of stories, and there's so many other children that never even made it back home. They either died at the boarding school, or they became ill. They didn't have the nurture. For those of us who understand psychology and well-being in children, we understand if they need the nurture, they need the care, they need to feel loved by an adult. And when they don't have that, their immune system is not as great. Their health disparities are a little bit higher. And so I think that's why during the boarding school era, we lost a lot of our children in these boarding schools. And not only that, just because of it, also mistreatment, and so there's a lot that we're just now scratching the surface of the boarding school era. And I can only tell you that there's going to be more bodies, more remains that come up in these boarding schools as they continue to dig deeper into them. But I think there's a lot to be learned there. Yes.
Thank you for sharing that, Lynette. We had another question come in. It's kind of a long description here with a question at the end, so I'll read through it. My great-grandmother is half Chippewa, Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and her parents were married at the time of her birth. She was registered as an illegitimate child when born. This is further proof of the one-drop rule from slavery times, and that Native marriages and births were not recognized or considered legitimate regardless of married parents. I believe this is a part of the problem from colonization times of seeing non-white people as not legitimate human beings. Unfortunately, people evolve slowly in this way. How can society overcome this dehumanization and create a more human connection?
Thank you so much for that, for sharing that, and thank you for that statement. You know, again, I'm a dreamer. You know, I'm a very optimistic person. You know, I have a lot of great partners in the realm of social services and victim advocates, you know, across the nation, and they're all different ethnicities. And I do believe that because we're getting a momentum in Indian country, so to speak, on our boarding school era and crisis and the damage that is done to our people and our community. Also with the MMIW movement, people are wanting to learn about it. People want to dive deeper. People want to understand, you know, how can they get involved? What can they do? You know, they're just as compelled to do something and act upon the like you said, the dehumanization of Native Americans throughout history, but they want to do something in the now. And I do believe that, you know, that we're in a place where not only our issues are finally getting some light, finally getting our stories in media and out there, but I do believe that it's going to take all of us collectively, for those of us who work in social services or, you know, whatever field you may be in. I think there's people out there, there's traction there is what I'm getting at. There's traction now in our issues and our trauma and the things that we're still fighting about. And I believe that we have good partnerships, the hearts and minds to start to try to change it. But it's going to take everybody. It's going to take all forces on board, whether you're in the victim advocate realm, whether you're in the law enforcement realm, social services. I mean, I think it should be mandatory for anybody who serves the community, anybody who works with the public should be educated, not only in child protection issues like human trafficking or child sex trafficking, but also on specifically for Native Americans issues as far as missing, murdered Indigenous persons, because that type of thing could be incorporated in their work, could be incorporated in their policies, and it could be another eye out on the issue and another resource for somebody who may need help. So, you know, that's a bigger conversation with people with bigger paychecks than me, but, you know, I do believe that we can, I think we're in a place where our issues are being highlighted and focused on, and we can get to that place of change. And again, I'm pretty sure yourself and myself and other Indigenous leaders and advocates, I mean, I'm in it here for a lifetime. I'm in this for a lifetime to try to change this, whether it's in data and research, whether it's in politics, whether it's in the political realm. I'm in it to change it all. And again, it's going to take all of us. Thank you for your statement. I really do appreciate it.
And Lynette, I was so wrapped up in the story that you were sharing that I lost track of time. And we are because I know I said I was going to give you a heads up when we're getting close to running out of time. And we are at 1:30 now, which is the time that this is slated to end. So I have a few closing comments, but I did just want to turn it over to you before we close, if there were any last things that you wanted to share.
I just want to thank everybody. I see there was like 178 participants that were, you know, on here that were listening to this issue and wanted to learn. I just want to say thank you. You know, I think I've reiterated this over and over again, but you know, it's going to take all of us, whatever realm or area that you live in, and even with your own family. You know, I think it takes all of us to do it. So I just want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I'm honored anytime anybody wants to listen to me. So thank you so much. And I just want to say again that I'm glad to be working in my Wind River Reservation to opening up a shelter, domestic violence and human trafficking, a safe house. So I'm glad to do the work, and I'm glad to partner with anybody who wants to learn more. But thank you so much for your time. I'm honored. Aho, Palomera.
Thank you so much for giving us your time and your experience and this essential call to action. It was so great getting to hear and learn from you. So many, many thanks to you. Thank you everyone in attendance for being a part of this event and for your commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice. Please fill out the evaluation. We have an evaluation link in the Q&A that you can follow if you have time now. You can also watch for an email coming later today with a link to complete an evaluation as well. We really do take your feedback to heart. We pass it along to our presenters, so we really do appreciate you taking the time to fill out those evaluations. And for those of you who requested CEUs when registering, you'll receive that in the email as well, in email. And just a heads up for what's happening now and for the rest of the afternoon. At 2 p.m. we'll have our closing session for the conference, a conversation between Oceana Sawyer and Ali Muldrow. It's going to be awesome, I think. We hope that you can make that, and you can see the link in the Q&A to be able to access that coming up at 2 o'clock. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Lynette Graybull.
Thank you.